Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books I review on this channel. Link in the description. Hey everybody, we are back with another edition of my top 100 best fantasy books of all time. We're now to the third to last video. We're at numbers 30 to 21. Click right up here if you want to catch up on the previous entries into the series. And without any further ado, let's jump right in with number 30, and it is Midnight Tides. This is the fifth book in *𝐬𝐿AZEN Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This was published back in 2004, and the last time it was on this list, it was number 21. This isn't like I don't like this book as much. It's this that I've read, 9 books since then that I've pushed up a little bit, and this one's pushed back a little bit. But yeah, this book's incredible for so many reasons. It's one of my favorite *𝐬𝐿AZEN books, even though I feel like it gets some criticism from *𝐬𝐿AZEN fans. Not that they don't love it. It's just not. A lot of people don't have it as their top, few best *𝐬𝐿AZEN books. But for me, it really checked all the boxes. *𝐬𝐿AZEN, and I'm not going to do a big breakdown of *𝐬𝐿AZEN because I've already talked about it multiple times, and I still have some *𝐬𝐿AZEN books to go back in the series. But needless to say, *𝐬𝐿AZEN is an enormously broad scope of a fantasy series that covers multiple continents, an enormous timeline, and just like the most epic events. But something special that happens in Midnight Tides that also happens in the second book, *𝗏𝗏𝐻𝑜USE Gates, is that the author has this incredible bravery to say, look, we've spent 4 books up to now, 1,000-ish books apiece, huge, chunky books talking about these characters that you know and love, and you have this inherent promise that, yeah, we're going to these are our characters, we're going to stick with them. But then you open up book number 5, and it's just full of characters that you've never met before, and then you finally realize that this entire book takes place on a different continent, dealing with entirely different events that feel completely disconnected from the others. Now, from reading this series that obviously they will connect at some point, but the fact that he goes an entire book without a single connection to the other ones, other than like the last few pages of the book, I think I'm remembering this right, but it's like the last few pages of the book, finally some of the characters start to intertwine. It's crazy. And you'd think that maybe this would be not the best reading experience, but the characters that were introduced here are some of the best. 2 of my favorite characters in this entire series were brought up here, and that's 𝗏𝗏 and 𝐵ug, these hilarious roommates that really broadened my eyes to how incredibly funny Steven Erikson can be as a writer. In fact, it was so funny that I ended up looking it up and saying, like, who can rival Steven Erikson for humor in a fantasy book? I came across Terry Pratchett. I'd known the name a lot, but I'd never read any of his books, and that sent me down a journey of reading pretty much all of the Discworld books. I skipped a couple of them, like the kids' books. But even then, I honestly feel like the humor that I got out of Erikson was better than what I got out of Pratchett, although very different. I mean, it's hard to judge different comedy styles when they're so incredibly different. Pratchett's got this kind of lighthearted, satirical look at things and mocking things in our culture, and Erikson is just kind of absurdist humor. And some more dark humor that just Pratchett doesn't attempt to do. And it blows my mind that an author like Erikson can somehow write the most beautiful poetic prose with like the deepest philosophical themes, and then write the most harebrained, wacky comedian duo that I've ever read. It's incredible. But beyond that, I felt like the plot of Midnight Tides, that I don't really want to go into for spoiling anything and just kind of keep things broad here. I feel like as a self-contained book, it had the best kind of beginning, middle, and end to a single story. It's not my favorite book of the group. I'm going to talk about some of the other ones later. But it did have, just looking at it from a plot perspective in one book, I felt like it really knocked it out of the park. Now, it did need another book taking place in the same location in book number 7. I believe it's 7, to kind of wrap up a lot of the storylines that you got brought up here. So it kind of feels like you kind of got to read those 2, they obviously don't read them back to back. You go back to the to different continent in book number 6, but when you come back in 7, it completes a lot of those and takes the story and moves on from there and goes on eastward in the world. But yeah, incredible stuff. I'll never forget it, and yeah, one that I am eagerly anticipating reading again in my reread of *𝐬𝐿AZEN, which I should hopefully kind of keep grinding into soon. I read the first one recently and should read the second one soon. Number 29 is Flowers of 𝐒𝐿M. This is the third book in the Wandering In series by 𝗏𝗏. This is published in 2020, and this is new to the list. So yeah, Flowers of 𝐒𝐿M was where I really truly fell in love with the Wandering In. And so it gets a little bit of a bump in my score here for really the feelings that it gave me when I finally realized that I'm reading an all-time favorite series. But I also feel like 𝗏𝗏 made the biggest jump as an author between the second and third book than this author has taken in any of the ones that I've read so far. And I've read about 8 of these things so far. And these are not short books. These books on the low end are about 1,000 pages, and on the high end they're 2,000, 2,100-ish pages. So gigantic books that cannot be published in a book format. You have to read them ebook format because they literally couldn't be bound. They're so big. But yeah, this one, the reason I feel like this is so high up is it showed me the scope that 𝗏𝗏 is dealing with here. The Wandering In is this, for those that are new to this channel, I talk about it a lot, but it's the longest fantasy series of all time. It's this lit RPG progression fantasy story that's got a lot of video game elements into it, about this young woman who finds herself transported into another world, like an RPG world with classes and skills and leveling up and all these things. But it's, that adds flair to it, but it's not like essential to the story like a lot of other RPG stories, lit RPG stories will be. But it just makes things more fun and interesting, and in that sense of like growth of these characters, and adds more fun and variety to it. But the stories we're dealing with essentially these two main characters, Aaron and Ryoko, mainly Aaron, this innkeeper, and then this girl who's like a message runner. But here, 𝗏𝗏 said, you know what? I have a bigger story to tell. I'm doing this. I want to give you flavor for this world. So they decided to put all these random chapters in these little mini storylines that are so well done, that deal with a different part of the continent, sometimes a similar part, sometimes they connect with the overall story, sometimes they don't. But it's like these mini books where 𝗏𝗏 will say, I'm going to write like 5 or 6 very long chapters back to back about this one character, and it's going to be a wonderful story on its own right. So it's just incredible, the writing style here, because not only does 𝗏𝗏, by nature of it originating as a web serial, where every chapter kind of needs to be its own story. So each of the chapters, which are quite long, I'd say each of the chapters is probably anywhere between 30 to 50 pages or so, probably more like 30 to 40. And they all have a beginning, middle, and end to them. But then you have these arcs to them of these characters that then have a beginning, middle, and end to them. And then you have the greater volumes that these are within, not necessarily the book, but the volumes, which multiple books will fit into a volume, that have a beginning, middle, and end. So as you're reading and going along this, it's hard. It makes it incredibly difficult to put this series in this book down, because you have so many different things going on in your brain and wanting to just read one more chapter to kind of get more of the story that you know that you're going to get. You're not going to get any of these wasted chapters that don't push the story forward. And it's one of the rare books. Obviously they exist. Maybe you've been hit by the bug. But it's hard for me to do that, where I'll say like, look, I forget what time it is, and by the time I'm blinking, it's like 4 a.m. That feeling that I sometimes get with some simulation type video games, like a Civilization or games like that, where I truly lose track of time. That's what happens in this, and this is the one where it really found its rhythm and just kind of knocked it out of the park. Number 28 is Kings of the Wild. This is the first book in the Banned series by Nicholas Eames. This was published in 2017. And last time this was number 8 on my list. So it moved down quite a bit. And it moved, I did not read 20 new books since I did this list. This is a reevaluation where I looked at it and said, like, I think my number 8 rating last time was far too high. I think I read the book very recently. Sometimes I give recency biases to the books that I read. And looking back on this a couple years later, I said, this is a more appropriate place that I'd fit this, which is still ridiculously high considering I've read hundreds and hundreds of fantasy books. Kings of the Wild is very unique, and well, maybe not truly unique, but unique for me in the hundreds of books that I've read, in that it doesn't deal with the traditional heroes. This deals with aging heroes that were heroes before the story was done. It deals with this band of heroes that decides to get the group back together for one last big mission to rescue the daughter of one of the people in this group. They're this mercenary band, and as you're reading it, you immediately start picking up on the fact that this entire book is, I don't know if it's almost like a parody or just like an homage to 70s rock and roll, of which I do love 70s rock and roll. Now, I do happen to like 80s rock and roll a bit more. It's littered with these references into it, even the names of certain characters and the names of different groups, and it's so many little Easter eggs there that I did not even get close to picking up on them all. So if you're like an enormous 70s rock and roll fan, this thing will be so elevated on your list, even above what I think of it, because you'll have this totally different aspect of the story that you're just going to be grinning from beginning to end. But the story on its own right is just, it's incredible. The arc of this story is so fun, where you have this character who decides that he finds that his daughter needs to be rescued, and he literally decides to get the band back together for one last hurrah, like one last concert, but it's like one last fight. And slowly getting the characters introduced to you. So you get this fun little mini story about each of the characters in this band as they're trying to bring them back in and convince them to go fight with them. Each of them are so terribly unique and wonderful and funny in many ways, or badass in different ways. And it's just this book that I found myself grinning from the moment that I picked up the book to the moment that I put it down, even though sometimes these bad events were going on, but it was just so dang enjoyable. And at the end of the day, I am not a professional book critic. I don't know how to do that. I was never trained in that. I will never be that way. I am a guy that decided to turn on the camera one day and wanted to tell you all what my thoughts about books were and how much I enjoyed books. And when I use that criteria, which is really the only criteria that I really look at, and the only one that I feel confident in my abilities to give you the honest truth in, because it's my opinion. When I look at it from that criteria, this book is an S+ knock out of the park home run, and everybody needs to give it a shot if you're looking for one of those adventure stories. Especially, I think if you're a little bit older. Now, I wouldn't even get close to calling myself old. I'm 39, but I think I'm older than a lot of other fantasy readers. I feel like a lot of fantasy kind of a lot of fantasy readers trend younger than me. Obviously, there's quite a bit older in the same age, but if you are a bit older and you can appreciate what it's like to be a parent and to have lived in life for a long time and be able to kind of have a different perspective than you do when you're a youth, I think you get even more out of this book than you might otherwise get, and maybe one of the reasons that I find this book so special. Number 27 is The Hero of Ages. This is book number 1 this is book number 3 in Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. This was published in 2008. And the last time this was number 19 on the list. So this dropped about, it was 8 spots. I'm really bad at math. This is one that I'm feeling pretty confident that I misjudged this one, because I'm in the middle of reading The Well of Ascension. And I had already read Mistborn: The Final Empire a month or two ago. And I did not really love Mistborn: The Final Empire, even though I thoroughly loved it the first time that I read it. And I'm reading The Well of Ascension, and I am also not loving it, even though I loved it the second time. And so my guess is that I'm going to read The Hero of Ages, and I'm going to not really love it either. And it's rare for me to do a reread of books, and even more rare to like a book less on my reread. Almost always when I do a reread, I like it significantly more. So I'm too fortunate, but still in my head, even though I haven't read it, I still have these incredibly positive feelings about it. So like today, right now, I like my ranking, but if you ask me in a couple of months after I'm done reading it, there's a good chance I might change my opinion. But the reason that I have the third book so much higher than the other two, and that I had the series so high up in my all-time list, is that Sanderson just knocked the ending out of the park. This is the one time that I've ever read the ending of a Sanderson series that he did himself. And it's special because Sanderson's superpower is plotting, and his ability to plan things out so that things make sense, they're fair, the surprises are perfectly done in the way that they're not sprung on you. They feel well developed, and they feel like you should have been picking it up all along, and for some reason you didn't. And that's the mark of genius writing. As I've read more Sanderson, I'm finding his faults more and more, but he truly is in a class of his own when it comes to that. And that's one of the hardest things to do in writing, and one of the things that can make the best sorts of books. And so there's still a reason that I love Sanderson, and that's really the one. And this is the book that exemplifies that the most. Ideally, Stormlight Archive can do the same kind of thing. And certainly I feel like Wheel of Time did that, although he didn't really, plan that one out himself. That was Robert Jordan. But yeah, this is just... It's so well done. I mean, the revelations that come out in this book, and there's at least two of them that I'm remembering, just jaw dropped me when I read it the first time. Now, this was one of the earlier books in my fantasy journey that I read, and so I hadn't had a ton of experience with twists. But even looking back on this, it's one of the best. These revelation moments are some of the best that I've ever seen. And to give you a hint about what they are, because I bet most of you read this and you're like, man, what exactly are you? What are you talking about? And how do I say this without spoiling things? And one of them I'll say is what happens with 𝐭𝐳 near the end of the book. And the other one is what happens with the tablets of the prophecy that Vin keeps reading over time. And is it Vin or 𝐭𝐳 that keeps reading over time? And what happens with those two major moments? And it's not just those moments that I feel like I loved, but the whole wrap up of the story. And it got me teary-eyed. And Sanderson's one of the only authors that can do that to me. He doesn't do it from a sadness perspective. I very rarely cry for sad moments, but I do cry for heroic moments and moments that get me kind of like hyped up and or redemption arcs, or these characters been held back so long and they finally got what they deserved in a good way. And those are the moments that can really get me, and those moments were aplenty in The Hero of Ages. Number 26 is 𝐶 the Hounds. This is book number 8 of Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This was published in 2008. And last time this was number 18 on my list. So again, moving back a little bit on my list, I'm just keep reading stuff that I like a little bit more than that. But 𝐶 the Hounds, man, this book is bonkers. This book is bonkers because this is the book that sets up the ending of the story. And I find I usually don't love books that are, towards the end of a story, that are not the end, because you never get these satisfying conclusions to the plot lines, because there's so much left that needs to be done. Like if there's a 5-book series, I'm probably going to dislike book 4 the most. And yeah, but there's a 10-book series, but book number 9 and 10 are the same book. They got split up by the publisher, so consider them basically the same thing. But the ending of 𝐶 the Hounds is the greatest ending to a story that I've ever read. And when I say ending, I don't mean, the last 10 pages of this 800-page book. I don't mean the last 100 pages. I don't even mean the last 150. I'm talking a solid 200 pages of the most balls to the wall, bonkers, perfectly set up, perfectly executed stuff that I've ever read in my entire life. It is stuck with me forever. I constantly think about it, and it's incredible. Whenever I find somebody reading Malazan for the first time, I look forward to getting their reaction to the ending of this book more than any other moment in all of fantasy, in all of their entire journey. It's something that I never saw coming, and there's no way that you could. It's not a surprise. It's not a revelation in the way that Sanderson does it. It's just these epic moments that couldn't get bigger than big, and they feel deserved and they feel right. And there's been this setup happening since the beginning of the story that you felt was ominous and strange. And why does that exist? Why is this happening? And finally you get why. And these moments of there's this one moment where the character that represents death physically manifests in the world. And there's this incredible moment and that feels very Abercrombie-ish. Abercrombie does this famous writing technique where he will be in the middle of a battle and a character will kill another character. And you're in the perspective of the character that died, and then it immediately jumps into the perspective of the person that killed him, and then that person gets killed, and it jumps to the person that killed him, and on and on and on. It's great. Some of the best writing that I've ever read. This is very reminiscent of that, where death is coming along, and then you start seeing all these people dying as a result of that. And, for unfortunate events and things, and from their perspective, and the reason that this is happening, and it's very powerful, and there's these incredible deaths that happen, and that feel like there's a purpose to them, and then when they all culminate together, and why they're culminating together, it's crazy. Now, the rest of the book, besides that ending, I found to be very different than the rest of the book, because one of Steven Erikson's parents had died shortly before writing this story, or maybe during writing this story, and so it changed into a very somber book, by far the most philosophical of all the books. Now, the deeply philosophical stuff that Erikson does, when he can kind of get overly done on the philosophy, has been the stuff that I've disliked the most of his writing, but it worked so well here. And maybe it was the passion about the personal experience that Erikson was going through that made me love it so much more than the other stuff that he's written that's been similar to that. But it worked so well, and it was the slow build as it went along, and it felt like it was going nowhere. And then when it finally does, it makes it all the more impactful, and just truly, truly one of those perfect stories. Number 25 is Of Darkness and Light. This is the second book in The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. This was published in 2021, and this is new to the list. This one is one you need to read. And I know that's true about all the other ones, but you have no excuse not to be reading this one, because some of the other ones on my list can be very niche. They're books that I could recognize. They're not for everybody. They're for me. I've found over time that what my reading tastes are. But this is one that I feel like everybody should enjoy. And it's one that I fear that a lot of people aren't going to get the wonderful experience of enjoying, because pretty much unanimously I shouldn't say unanimously, that's never true. A large amount of people that read the first book in this series, how am I forgetting the first book in the series name? God, that's rough, Matt. I'm getting old. But the first book in the series, I find, is significantly worse than the other books in the series. It's good, but it's cookie cutter. It feels like something that Robert Jordan would have wrote. In fact, it feels very similar to something Robert Jordan would have wrote. And the plot lines feel kind of similar. And the writing isn't incredible, and the characters feel a little bit stale, and the story doesn't get too expansive, and you're sticking with these characters, and you're like, I kind of want to branch off and experience this wonderful world that's been crafted, and it feels like a lot of missed potential. And what I heard when I read it was that, it's not as good as the rest of the books. And so I trusted. Normally when I read a book like that, I'll say, okay, it's not for me. But I decided to move on, and thank God that I did, because this book it solved all of the problems in the first book, and then elevated the writing so much. The story branches off into this incredible multi-POV story that ventures to all corners of this world. You get these major kind of surprise plot moments. This book is set up and borrows so much from so many great authors. And then this one, he goes, and now that we're here, I'm going to go do my Ryan Cahill thing. And some of the richest world building that you're ever going to read. Wonderful writing. The writing quality itself, in my opinion, elevated so much. It almost felt like not the same author. Obviously it is, but his takes on things, it felt like he actually, built in some actually like interesting, thought processes of these characters, and like these connections to other things, and these incredibly intelligent things that were written that you feel like are famous quotes that we would use on a day-to-day basis. And then you Google them, and they're not famous. They're just Ryan Cahill came up with them, and it's wonderful, and it just sets things up so well for the rest of the series. And I feel like truly the series should go down as one of the all-time great epic fantasy stories. Number 24 is The Last Light. This is the fifth book in the Wandering Inn series by Pyra Abba, published in 2021, and this is new to the list. Obviously, the other one was new. This one has to be new too, right? I'm not going to spend much time talking about The Wandering Inn. I just did. If you want to learn about Wandering Inn, go back to watch a few numbers back when I was talking about the third book in this series. But The Last Light, it took everything from what I just told you about the third book, and it just moved it up. It's like Pyra Abba just kept leveling up as an author, and realizing that like some of the best writing that Pyra Abba does is telling these side stories. especially the story of The Last Light. The Last Light being this medic that was reminiscent of kind of like the Red Cross, where, you know, they don't take a side in a conflict and all they want to do is help people. And there's a war going on, and they find that they are this skilled medic in this world that doesn't really have very good medics, and they're going to do everything they can to try to save everybody. It's an incredibly moving story. But there's other stories here as well that are just incredible. You know, we're starting to go more into this, into the different continents of this world that have nothing to do with the rest of the story, but you have this intrinsic promise that they will eventually get there. Hundreds of pages dealt with these other side stories that just give it the most epic of epic feels. I love so many of the characters that I introduced here. Some of my favorite characters in this entire series have been developed so thoroughly in this part of the story. And yeah, just incredible stuff. And like, if you're not really wandering in, I feel bad for you. It's clearly not for everybody. You know, it's not this masterpiece in writing that, from a skill perspective. But the skill comes from the world. The skill comes from the depth of this story and the fun of the story. And as I go back to talking about my criteria, you know, this whole series is some of the most fun writing that I've ever read. And the fact that it goes on for basically ever, I mean, it's such a long series. It's multiple times the length of The Wheel of Time. But also somehow does it in a way that doesn't feel like you need to read them all. You do need to read them in order, but like you could just read a book and be done and be like, okay, that was satisfying. Things are in a place where I feel happy, you know, and I don't need to know everything that goes on. Now, if you do get the bug like I do and you want to keep going, you can. But you don't need to be like intimidated by being like, oh, dang, I got to read these thousands and tens of thousands of pages to be able to understand the plot here. And that's not the way the story goes. But yeah, great stuff. Number 23 is The Heroes. This is the second standalone book in the First Lost series by Joe Abercrombie. This was published in 2011, and the biggest jump that you're ever going to see on this list. And last time, this was ranked below number 100. This did not show up on my list, even though I had read it. And this is one of those experiences where I reread this book, and I realized the brilliance of it when I read it the second time. And the first time that I read it, I had this expectation going in that it was going to be something that it was not. I read the first Law trilogy, and I was blown away. It was amazing. And I knew that there were these 3 standalone books, but I didn't really know much about them. And when I read the first one, all of them, I didn't love any of the 3 standalone books. And all I wanted to do was go back to the trilogy style that Abercrombie writes, where his brilliance comes out. But what I failed to realize was that he's one of the best standalone writers in fantasy today. And this story in particular, I kind of feel like an idiot for not loving it the first time that I read it. What was I thinking? I don't get it. I wish I did a video on it the first time I read it, but it was before I was doing videos. So I could look back and really hear my thoughts initially after them, because, thoughts change over time and you never really remember exactly what you were thinking sometimes when you thought it, when your thoughts change. I think that's human nature. Maybe it's just Matt. But the story is about a 3-day long battle, and the entire book is about this battle between these two sides. And in true Abercrombie fashion, it jumps between multiple characters that are on both sides of this. So, it doesn't feel like there's this good side or bad side. It just feels like two sides. But all the while this battle's going on, you have the most incredible character dynamics going on. You have this incredible political struggle going on between both sides of this for very different reasons. You have a way lesser emphasis on fantasy. This feels like a historical fiction book almost, with some very, very, very tiny fantasy elements in it, almost nothing. And it's perfect for that. And, I mentioned earlier that Abercrombie thing where you have these chapters where characters jump around from the character that kills them, and, somebody dies, and the character that killed him, you're now going to see it from their perspective for a couple pages or even less. And that was the first utilized in this book, and it was incredible. One of the most incredible chapters that I've ever read, even to this date. But just getting to learn from some of these characters, some of the funniest characters in the story are in this book. I mean, Corporal Tunney in this story as a POV character is just incredible. This cynical military guy that doesn't want to be in battle, but wants to be stuck at this rank because he knows it's the perfect rank for him to be to really never get in too much danger. And just the way that he looks at the world and his unit is just incredible. It's getting so much more of the northern kind of like gruff Northmen, the wild men kind of perspective, fighting against the classic, people in shining armor kind of side of things, and the breakdowns in how their military structure goes. And it's wonderful. I love military stuff, and this is one of the best military books that have ever been written. And it's not even about a real military. Number 22 is a book that you've probably read before, or at least know the plot of, and it is A Clash of Kings. This is the second book in A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, published in 1998. And the last time this was number 16 on this list, so it dropped a little bit, but not very much. You'll see it a lot in this list that the books will drop like 8 or 9 spots because I read 8 or 9. But this is one of those reevaluating ones where I keep looking at a lot of the books in A Song of Ice and Fire is my benchmark for whether a fantasy book is good or great, or even better than that, like great or incredible. And even though those feel like synonyms of each other, but in my mind they're not. And yeah, A Clash of Kings, man, it did that thing where it took that world and it expanded on it in such an amazing way. George R. R. Martin has such an incredible way of writing his characters. It's some of the best character writing that I've ever read. But every aspect of this book is wonderful. The plotting here of this battle between the brothers and the fight that they have to take over the kingdom. Multiple brothers here. You get the Starks getting spread out across the land and the tragedy that goes along with them. You start to investigate more about Jon Snow in the north and what it means to be living up there and trying to find his way up there, and the injustices that exist and him trying to prevail, on top of them. I read this book a long time ago. I reread it a few times, kind of back to back. I was like obsessed with the series. But I still have so many of these vivid memories of how wonderful this is. The world building is just incredible. These, pages and pages and pages of detail on the houses and everybody in them. And, the back of the book that has, so much reference material. I love that kind of stuff. And you can just do deep dives into it and figure out, the map is just gorgeous with so many little towns and cities, and they're all relevant, and it's magical stuff. And George R. R. Martin deserves to go down as one of the greatest all-time fantasy writers for this stuff, even though the series is never going to get finished. That's okay. Read them anyways. They're incredible. All right. I know I have not talked about this series enough, right? And we're going to talk about it again with number 21. It is Reaper's Gale. This is the 7th book in Malazan Book of the Fallen. Last time was number 15. It's written by Steven Erikson, of course, published in 2007. Not going to spend very much time talking about this because I already talked a lot about when I talked earlier about Midnight Tides, and I said that it has a back half, this is the one that's the back half. If I'm going to read something that's 2 parts, I'm always going to like the second part more than the first. It gets the ending, you get all these conclusions, these major moments, a couple enormous things that go on in this that are heartbreaking and incredible and magical and huge, and these huge, powerful units coming together in these enormous battles, and everything is incredible. And God damn, I love this series so much. I sometimes I wish I didn't have a booktube channel. I have way more aside on the fact that I love doing the booktube stuff, but I wish I could just go back and read all of Malazan back to back. And I didn't have this schedule and people that kind of looked to me to be reading these different kind of books, and people that would get bored about me reading just like one series back to back to back, because God, I can't stop thinking about this series. I want to read it so badly. But I will. Over the next couple of years, I'll probably get through all 10 of these. But I got to put a little more focus on them if I'm going to kind of keep up to that. So that is it. I only have 2 more of these left before I'm done. I know I've gone way slower than I initially thought. The first time I did this top 100 list 2 years ago, I did them like pretty much weekly. Now I'm doing them like every few weeks. So in a month or 2, I'll be done with this thing, and then we can kind of move forward with the rest of I put a lot of my content on hold on top 10 lists outside of this. I've just been doing book reviews outside of this and my recap of the month kind of stuff and TBR videos. But we'll get back into that when this is done. But I do love cataloging all the stuff with you so you can kind of see where my reading tastes currently are. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Amy, Anna G, CJ, Doust, Darren, JD, Jonathan, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, Orthodoxia, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Slay, Sydney Baker, Tahir, Zion, Anna, Andra, Blair, Brock, Evan, Harry W, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Michael Sugarman, Sky, and Tyler. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.